In 1918, a doctor with no real training in aircraft engineering built a fighter plane he swore would be the fastest in the world. He told the United States government it would help win the war. He even convinced them to lend him one of their rare prototype Liberty engines. And on its very first flight, his creation did something no aircraft should ever do. Its wings twisted, folded back, and tore completely off the fuselage. The plane fell out of the sky and killed the pilot at the controls, a young man named Cuthbert Mills. The doctor's name was William Whitney Christmas. The aircraft was called the Christmas Bullet, and it is remembered today as one of the worst flying machines ever built. But here is the strange part. It is not even close to being alone. Over the next 25 minutes, we are going to count down the most pointless warplanes ever made. Aircraft that were obsolete the day they left the hangar. Machines so badly designed, they killed more of their own pilots than the enemy ever did. And ideas so absurd, you will wonder how anyone ever signed off on them. A few of these names you might recognize. Most of them, the men who built them, would rather you forgot. Stay with me to the end, because the further down this list we go, the stranger and the deadlier these machines become. Let me go back to that Christmas Bullet for a moment, because it sets the pattern for everything that follows. William Christmas was not an aircraft designer. He was a physician and a relentless self-promoter who claimed he had discovered a revolutionary secret about flight. He believed an aircraft's wings should flex and flap freely in the air, like the wings of a bird, with no struts and no bracing wires to hold them steady. Every engineer of the era knew this was madness. Christmas ignored them all. He built his fighter with long, unsupported wings, talked his way into government backing, and put it in the air. When those unbraced wings met the force of real flight, they simply gave way. And here is the detail that tells you everything. After the first prototype disintegrated and killed its pilot, Christmas built a second one, and that aircraft tore itself apart and killed its pilot too. He never admitted the design was flawed. The Christmas Bullet killed everyone who ever flew it, and its creator called it a triumph. But a plane that kills its pilot in the air is one kind of failure. The next aircraft on our list never even managed to leave the ground in one piece. In 1919, as the First World War ended, Britain was still chasing a dream weapon, a giant bomber large enough to fly all the way to Berlin and flatten it. The company chosen to build it was not even an aircraft manufacturer. It was Tarrant, a firm that built wooden structures and barracks. What they produced was a monster called the Tabor, a towering triplane, one of the largest aircraft in the world at the time, lifted by 6 engines. On paper, it was a marvel. In reality, it carried a fatal flaw hidden in plain sight. To generate enough power, the designers had stacked some of those engines high up, well above the center of the aircraft, and nobody fully understood what that would do. On its first attempt to take off, the crew opened the throttles. The lower engines pulled the aircraft forward, but the moment the upper engines came to full power, mounted so high above the body, they shoved the nose violently downward. The enormous bomber tipped forward onto its nose before it ever truly flew, crushing the cockpit and killing the 2 pilots at the controls. The largest bomber Britain had ever built destroyed itself on the runway in seconds. It never flew a single mission. It never dropped a single bomb. It was a triumph of ambition over physics, and the physics won. By the time the Second World War arrived, you might assume engineers had learned their lesson. They had not. They had simply found new and more creative ways to fail. And the next aircraft was not killed by bad physics. It was killed by a bad idea. The Bolton Paul Defiant looked like a proper fighter. It was sleek, it was fast enough, and it carried 4 machine guns. But those guns were not where you would expect. The Defiant had no forward-firing weapons at all. Not one. Instead, every gun was packed into a heavy, powered turret mounted behind the pilot, facing backward and to the sides. The theory was that the Defiant would fly alongside enemy bombers and rake them from angles a normal fighter could not. The designers forgot one thing. Enemy fighters do not politely line up behind you. When the Defiant first met the Luftwaffe over Dunkirk, it actually scored kills, but only because German pilots mistook it for the Hurricane it resembled and attacked from behind, flying straight into the path of those turret guns. It was a brief, deadly trick, and it lasted exactly as long as it took the Germans to figure out the truth. Once they realized the Defiant could not fire forward, they simply attacked it head-on and from below, where it was completely defenseless. The slaughter was immediate. In a single engagement during the summer of 1940, most of an entire Defiant squadron was wiped from the sky. The aircraft was quietly pulled from daylight combat, a fighter that could not fight back. If you think a fighter with no forward guns is bad, the next aircraft did something far worse. It attacked its own crews. Germany desperately needed a long-range heavy bomber, and the answer was supposed to be the Heinkel 177, a powerful machine called the Grief, meaning Griffin. But the design hid a disastrous decision. Instead of 4 engines turning 4 separate propellers, the engineers bolted the engines together in pairs, so that 2 engines drove a single propeller on each wing. Cramming all that machinery together created a furnace of heat in a tight space, surrounded by oil and fuel lines. The engines ran hot. Oil pooled where it should not. And again, the Heinkel 177 caught fire in midair. It happened so often that German crews stopped trusting it entirely and gave it a grim nickname. They called it the Reichsleiter because it lit itself on fire. To make matters worse, the German high command had demanded that this enormous heavy bomber also be able to dive bomb like a much smaller plane, which forced the structure to be strained in ways that made the engine problems even harder to solve. Crews were lost not to British fighters or anti-aircraft guns, but to their own aircraft simply bursting into flames around them. A bomber meant to carry the war to the enemy spent much of its career as a threat to the men inside it. But even a bomber that catches fire gives its crew a chance to jump. The next aircraft offered no such mercy. It could kill you before you ever reach the enemy, and it could do it on the ground. The Messerschmitt 163. Comet was, in raw performance, astonishing. It was a tiny rocket-powered interceptor, and it was the fastest aircraft of the entire war, capable of more than 600 miles an hour at a time, when most fighters struggled to reach half that. It would rocket upward at an incredible angle, slash through enemy bomber formations, and glide back to Earth. On paper, it was the future. In practice, it was a flying bomb with a man strapped inside. The problem was its fuel. The Comet ran on 2 violently reactive chemical propellants, and one of them was so corrosive and unstable that it could burn through metal, rubber, and human flesh alike. A leak in the wrong place could dissolve a pilot inside his own cockpit. The aircraft took off from a small wheeled trolley that it dropped after leaving the ground, and it landed by sliding back down onto a simple skid, which meant any rough landing with leftover fuel still aboard could end in an explosion. The Comet shot down only a handful of enemy planes, but it killed a disturbing number of its own pilots, not in battle, but in landing accidents, fuel leaks, and explosions. It was one of the most advanced aircraft of its age, and one of the deadliest places its own pilots could possibly sit. And yet, as the war turned against Germany, even the Comet was not desperate enough. What came next abandoned the idea of a normal aircraft altogether. By the final months of the war, with Allied bombers darkening the skies, German engineers reached for something close to madness. It was called the Bochum 349 Natter, meaning Viper, and it was barely an airplane at all. It was a rocket built mostly of wood, designed to stand upright and launch straight into the air like a missile, with a pilot inside. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. The Natter would blast vertically off a launch tower, climb directly into a bomber formation, fire a salvo of rockets from its nose, and then break apart in the air, allowing the pilot and the precious rocket engine to float back down separately by parachute. The aircraft itself was considered disposable, almost as disposable as the pilot. On the 1st of March, 1945, they attempted the first vertical launch with a man on board. The test pilot was named Lothar Sieber. The Natter roared off its tower and climbed, and then, seconds into the flight, the canopy tore away. The aircraft pitched over, rolled out of control, and slammed back into the earth at full speed. Lothar Sieber was killed instantly. The very first time a human being rode this machine into the sky, it killed him. It was a weapon born purely out of desperation, and it never came close to changing anything. You might think that with the war over and the jet age beginning, these disasters would finally stop. They did not. The mistakes simply put on a new, modern face. In the late 1940s, the United States had built an enormous new bomber, the B-36, designed to fly farther than any aircraft before it. But that range created a problem. No fighter could escort it the whole way. So American engineers came up with an answer that sounds like something out of a comic book. They would build a tiny fighter that the bomber could carry inside its own belly, drop out in midair to fight off attackers, and then catch again in the sky. They called it the XF-85 Goblin. The Goblin was a strange little egg-shaped jet with a hook on its nose, and it had no landing gear at all because it was never supposed to touch the ground. It would hang from a trapeze beneath the mothership, drop free, and later fly back up and reconnect to that same trapeze in open air. And that final step turned out to be nearly impossible. The air swirling violently around the giant bomber threw the tiny Goblin around like a leaf. The test pilot, Edwin Schock, fought to dock again and again, and on one attempt, the trapeze smashed into his canopy and shattered it, forcing him to make an emergency landing. The aircraft was never built to survive. After a handful of these white-knuckle tests, the whole idea was abandoned. The flying parasite fighter was simply too dangerous to ever work. But the most haunting failure of the jet age was not a wild experiment. It was a frontline fighter, ordered in numbers, that turned out to be a killer of its own pilots. The Vought F-7U Cutlass was meant to be the future of naval aviation, a sleek, tailless jet unlike anything the Navy had flown before. It looked fast and futuristic, sitting on the carrier deck. But its engines were badly underpowered and unreliable, so much so that pilots stopped calling it the Cutlass and started calling it the Gutless Cutlass. Its design forced it into a steep, nose-high angle when landing, which meant the pilot was often fighting for control at the exact moment he needed it most, trying to drop onto a moving carrier deck with engines that could not be trusted to respond. The results were tragic. The Cutlass had a brutal accident record, and by some accounts, nearly 1 in 4 of every one built was lost in a crash. In one accident, the commander of an entire air group, a man named J. Al-Khair, was killed when his Cutlass came in low on its approach and struck the back end of the carrier in front of everyone watching. This was not a rushed wartime prototype thrown together in desperation. It was a peacetime aircraft, carefully planned and mass-produced, and it still followed the same deadly pattern we saw all the way back at the beginning, with a doctor and his folding wings in 1918. Because that is the thread running through every machine on this list. Across more than 30 years, through propellers and rockets and jets, the same mistake kept repeating itself in 100 different forms. Engineers and leaders fell in love with an idea, a bird that flapped its wings, a bomber too big for its own engines, a fighter aimed the wrong way, a rocket made of wood, and they chased that idea straight past the warnings, past the laws of physics, and past the lives of the men who would have to fly it. The Christmas Bullet, the Tarrant Tabor, the Defiant, the Heinkel Grief, the Comet, the Natter, the Goblin, and the Cutlass did not fail. Because the people who built them were stupid. They failed because ambition, desperation, and ego are powerful enough to silence common sense. Each one promised to change the war, or to win the skies, or to leap into the future. Each one instead became a lesson written in wreckage. And the most sobering thought of all is that every single one of these machines was approved, funded, and flown by people who were absolutely certain they had built something brilliant. That is what makes a warplane truly pointless. Not just that it failed, but that everyone involved believed, right up until the moment it fell, that it would work. If you found this fascinating, hit subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell here. The real verdict on the machine's history would rather forget. I will see you in the next one.